I'm Clara Voss. I'm 18 years old, and I was raised to marry my cousin to preserve our bloodline. I know it sounds insane. I know it sounds like something out of a horror movie or some twisted documentary you'd watch at 3 in the morning when you can't sleep. But in my family, it was a destiny you couldn't escape. It was written in blood, literally and figuratively, before I even understood what marriage meant, before I even had my first kiss, or held someone's hand in that nervous, sweaty way teenagers do. Before I tell you how I ran, exposed them, and watched the FBI storm our house with guns drawn and voices shouting commands that shattered the silence our family had maintained for generations, I need you to do something for me. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from, because what you're about to hear isn't fiction. This isn't some creative writing exercise or clickbait story designed to get views. This is my life. This is what they did to me. This is what I survived. In our house, marriage wasn't about love. It was never about finding someone who made your heart race, or who understood you in ways no one else could. It wasn't about partnership or companionship or any of those things normal people talk about when they talk about spending their lives with someone. Marriage was about genetics. It was about preserving something they called the purity of our line. As if we were some kind of rare breed of dog or an endangered species that needed careful cultivation. My cousin Adrian was chosen for me before I turned 13, before I even started my period, before I understood what it meant to be a woman, or what they expected from my body. They picked him like you'd pick out china patterns or furniture for a house you're building, with careful consideration and cold calculation. I remember the day they told me. I was 12 years old, sitting in our dining room, the one with the heavy oak table that had been in our family for 6 generations. My mother sat on one side of me, my father on the other, and across from me was my Aunt Helen and Uncle Richard, Adrian's parents. They were all smiling, these weird, tight smiles that didn't reach their eyes, and my father cleared his throat in that way he did when he was about to say something he considered important. He told me I was special. He told me I carried something precious in my blood, something that couldn't be diluted or contaminated by outsiders. He told me that when I was old enough, when my body was ready, I would marry Adrian and we would have children who would carry on our legacy. They said it like it was an honor. They said it like I should be grateful. I didn't understand at first. Adrian was my cousin. He was the boy I'd played with at family gatherings, the one who pulled my hair when we were little and cheated at board games. He was family. But they explained it to me like it was the most natural thing in the world. They told me that throughout history, the greatest families had kept their bloodlines pure. They mentioned royalty, they mentioned ancient civilizations, they mentioned names and dynasties I'd never heard of. They made it sound noble. They made it sound like destiny. Our family had money. Not the kind of money that's flashy or obvious, but old money. The kind that whispers instead of shouts. We lived in a house that looked like something out of an architectural magazine, all stone and high ceilings and rooms that echoed when you walked through them alone. In town, people respected my father. He sat on boards, he donated to charities, he shook hands with mayors and senators. My mother was always perfectly dressed, perfectly poised, the kind of woman other women wanted to impress. From the outside, we looked like the American dream. From the outside, we looked normal. But inside those stone walls, we were anything but normal. Every dinner was a biology lesson about preserving our kind. My father would talk about recessive genes and dominant traits like other fathers talked about sports or work. They had charts on the walls in my father's study. Actual genealogical charts that mapped out our family tree going back hundreds of years. My name and Adrian's were written in red ink at the bottom, connected by a line, like destiny already decided. Under our names were blank spaces, waiting for the children we were expected to produce. They started preparing me early. I was homeschooled, never allowed to attend regular school where I might meet other kids, where I might develop crushes on boys who weren't related to me, where I might start to question why my family was so different. My mother taught me reading and math and history, but always with a slant, always with that ideology woven through everything. She'd talk about how the greatest civilizations fell when they allowed their bloodlines to mix, when they let outsiders corrupt their genetic legacy. She made diversity sound like a disease. I wasn't allowed to have friends outside the family. The few times other kids from town came over for some family event, I was monitored constantly. My mother or father or one of my aunts would hover nearby, listening to every word, making sure I didn't form any real connections. They controlled my phone, reading every text message, listening to every call. I thought it was because they were strict, because they were protective. I didn't realize until much later that it was because they were afraid. Afraid I'd tell someone. Afraid I'd realize how wrong it all was. When I turned 14, they started what they called purity lessons. These were sessions with my mother and my aunts where they'd talk to me about my body, about saving myself, about how I belonged to Adrian and only Adrian. They made me feel like my body wasn't even mine, like it was just a vessel for their plans, a container for the bloodline they were so desperate to preserve. They talked about my future children like they were already real, like they were more important than I was. I was just the incubator. I was just the means to an end. Adrian was 4 years older than me. As I got older, as I started to develop, he started looking at me differently. Not with the innocent familiarity of cousins, but with something else, something that made my skin crawl. He'd find excuses to touch me, to stand too close, to let his hand linger on my shoulder or my waist. And our families encouraged it. They'd smile and make comments about how well suited we were, how beautiful our children would be. They were grooming both of us, but especially me. The anger I felt was something I couldn't name at first. It sat in my chest like a stone, heavy and cold. I'd lie in bed at night and try to imagine my future, and all I could see was Adrian's face, his hands on me, a life I didn't want but couldn't escape. I felt trapped in my own body, in my own family, in a destiny I'd never chosen. But I also felt guilt because they'd taught me so well. They'd taught me that this was my purpose, that resisting would be selfish, that I owed it to my family, to my ancestors, to carry on their legacy. The manipulation was so deep, so thorough, that even as part of me screamed that this was wrong, another part of me wondered if they were right. When I was 15, they took me to a doctor. Not a regular doctor, but someone they knew, someone who was part of their network. He examined me in ways that made me feel violated and ashamed. He talked to my parents about my fertility, about my reproductive health, like I wasn't even in the room. He gave them a timeline, told them when my body would be optimal for pregnancy. I was 15 years old, sitting in a paper gown in a cold examination room, listening to adults discuss my uterus like it was a crop field they were planning to plant. The wedding date was set for the summer after I turned 18. They started planning it when I was 16, talking about venues and flowers, and dresses like this was something I wanted, something I was excited about. My mother would show me pictures of wedding gowns and I'd nod and smile because that's what I'd been trained to do. Inside, I was dying. Inside, I was screaming. I started having nightmares. I'd dream about the wedding, about walking down an aisle toward Adrian, and in the dreams I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't run. I'd wake up sweating, my heart pounding, tears on my face. During the day, I'd go through the motions, attending my lessons, sitting through family dinners, smiling when expected. But I was fragmenting, splitting into pieces, becoming someone I didn't recognize. The first crack in their perfect plan came when I was 17. I was in my father's study, looking for a book, and I found a drawer that wasn't completely closed. Inside were old photographs, documents, things that looked ancient and forgotten. I should have closed it. I should have walked away. But something made me dig deeper. I found a diary. It was old, the leather cover cracked and fading, the pages yellowed with age. On the inside cover, written in careful script, was a name. Elizabeth Voss. My grandmother. My father's mother, who died before I was born. At least, that's what they'd always told me. She died in an accident, they said. A tragic loss, they said. They never wanted to talk about her much, always changed the subject when I asked questions. But as I read her diary, a different story emerged. Elizabeth hadn't died in an accident. Elizabeth had tried to run away. She'd been in the same position I was in, promised to a cousin, trapped in the same sick tradition. But she'd fallen in love with someone else, someone from outside the family, and she'd tried to escape. The diary entries became more desperate as I read. Her handwriting shakier, her words more frantic. She wrote about how they'd caught her, how they'd brought her back, how they'd locked her in her room and told her she'd marry who they chose or she'd never leave. The last entry was dated 3 days before her supposed death. She wrote, "If I disappear, if they say I had an accident, know that I fought, know that I didn't want this. Know that I loved someone they could never accept, and they couldn't forgive me for it. To whoever reads this, run. Run and never look back. This family is a prison, and they are the jailers." My hands were shaking so hard I almost dropped the diary. My grandmother didn't die in an accident. They killed her. Or they made her disappear. They erased her because she wouldn't comply, because she dared to want something different, someone different. And they'd done it so thoroughly that even her own son, my father, either didn't know the truth or had convinced himself of the lie. I kept reading. I found other documents in that drawer, things that made my blood run cold. There were records of other marriages in our family, going back generations. Cousins marrying cousins, uncles marrying nieces, relationships that made my stomach turn. There were medical records documenting the results. Children born with disabilities, with genetic disorders, with problems that came from too much inbreeding. But there were also notes about these children being dealt with, being sent away, being hidden. The family's obsession with genetic purity had created the opposite, had created suffering and sickness, and they'd covered it up, hidden the evidence, maintained the lie. I thought I was the first, but I wasn't. My grandmother tried to stop them years ago and vanished. Her diary told me what they did to girls who refused, and suddenly, I understood that I wasn't just fighting for my future, I was fighting for my life. I started planning. I couldn't let them know I knew. I couldn't let them see the change in me. So I became a better actress than I'd ever been. I smiled more. I seemed more compliant. I asked questions about the wedding planning with fake enthusiasm. I let Adrian hold my hand at family dinners and I didn't pull away, even though his touch made me want to crawl out of my skin. I played the role they wanted me to play while inside. I was building an escape route. I needed help. I couldn't do this alone. I started by testing the boundaries of my internet access. They monitored my phone, but I was allowed to use the family computer for schoolwork. I was careful, so careful, clearing my history, using incognito windows, only researching when I was sure no one would check. I looked up stories of other people who'd escaped similar situations. I found forums, support groups, networks of people who helped others get out of controlling families or dangerous situations. I reached out to a group that helped people escape from high-control environments. I used a fake email address, never gave my real name at first, just told them my situation in vague terms. The woman who responded called herself Sarah. She told me she'd helped dozens of people get out of situations like mine. She told me I wasn't crazy. She told me I deserved freedom. Those words, coming from someone who didn't have a stake in controlling me, who didn't benefit from my compliance, broke something open inside me. Sarah became my lifeline. We communicated in secret, in messages I'd delete immediately after reading. She helped me make a plan. She told me what I'd need: documents, money, a safe place to go. She told me to gather evidence if I could, things that would prove what my family was doing. Because they'd tried to discredit me, tried to make me seem like a troubled teen running away from a loving family. I started stealing small amounts of cash from my mother's purse, from my father's wallet, never enough to be noticed. I hid it in a tampon box, knowing my father would never look there. I took photos of the documents in his study with my phone, then uploaded them to a secret cloud account and deleted them from my device. I photographed the genealogical charts, the medical records, my grandmother's diary. I built a case against my own family. The wedding was scheduled for June. In March, 3 months before, things started to accelerate. My family's behavior changed. They became more watchful, more controlling. I wasn't allowed to be alone anymore. Someone was always with me, always monitoring. At first, I thought maybe they'd found out somehow, but then I realized it was just part of their plan. As the wedding approached, they were making sure I couldn't develop cold feet, couldn't run. They started talking about the wedding night with this horrible frankness, about consummating the marriage, about the children we'd have. My Aunt Helen told me it was my duty to submit to Adrian, to give him sons, to be grateful for the role I was playing in our family's future. She said these things while we were addressing wedding invitations, her voice casual like she was discussing the weather. Adrian became bolder. He'd corner me in hallways, try to kiss me, put his hands on me in ways that were no longer even pretending to be innocent. When I'd pull away, my mother would scold me. She'd tell me he was going to be my husband, that I needed to get used to his affection, that my resistance was childish and inappropriate. They were normalizing assault. They were training me to accept violation. I felt like I was suffocating. Every day was a battle to maintain my facade, to keep smiling, to keep pretending. At night, I'd lock my bedroom door and curl up in the corner, rocking back and forth, trying to breathe through panic attacks that left me gasping and dizzy. The rage I felt was consuming. I hated them. I hated every single person in my family who'd participated in this, who'd looked at me and seen not a person but a breeding tool, a means to preserve their precious bloodline. I hated myself for taking so long to see it, for all the years I'd accepted it, for all the times I'd smiled when I should have screamed. In April, something happened that moved up my timeline. I was in the kitchen with my mother when I overheard my father on the phone in his study. His voice was low, but I could make out words. Accelerate the timeline. She's showing signs of resistance. The ceremony needs to happen sooner. My blood went cold. They knew. Somehow they knew I was planning something, or at least they suspected. That night, my father called a family meeting. He, my mother, my aunt, my uncle, and Adrian all sat around that dining room table with me. My father's face was stern, his voice hard in a way I rarely heard. He told me that they'd been too lenient with me, too patient. He said that I was showing signs of being corrupted by modern thinking, that I was spending too much time on the computer, that I needed to be more carefully guided. Effective immediately, I wasn't allowed internet access. My phone was taken away. I wasn't to be alone at any time. And then he said something that made my heart stop. He said that they'd decided to move the wedding up. We weren't waiting until June. The ceremony would happen in 2 weeks, at the end of April, in a private ceremony at our house. Just family, just us. I wanted to scream. I wanted to flip the table, to run, to fight. But I just nodded. I said I understood. I said whatever they wanted to hear. Because I knew that if I showed my true feelings, if I let them see my horror and rage, they'd lock me up. They'd do to me what they'd done to my grandmother. Adrian was smiling. He reached across the table and took my hand, squeezed it hard enough to hurt. I'm excited, he said, his eyes on mine, and there was something dark in them, something possessive and cruel. I've waited so long for this. I had 2 weeks. 2 weeks to get out. And now I had no phone, no internet, no way to contact Sarah or anyone else who might help me. I felt the walls closing in, felt the traps snapping shut around me. That night, I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling and tried not to give in to despair. But despair turned to determination. They wanted to rush this because they were afraid. That meant I still had power, even if I couldn't see it yet. I still had a choice. Even if the window was closing, I would not marry Adrian. I would not become another Elizabeth, another disappeared girl whose story got erased. I would fight. I started looking for opportunities. They were watching me, but they couldn't watch me every second. I still had to use the bathroom alone. I still had moments in my room with the door closed. I found an old phone in a drawer in the guest room, a flip phone from years ago. I charged it in an outlet behind my dresser where no one would see. I didn't know if it would work, if it could make calls, but it was something. The phone worked. It didn't have internet, but I could make calls. I knew Sarah's number by heart from our messages. On a Wednesday afternoon, when my mother was in the garden and thought I was napping, I called Sarah from my closet, my voice barely above a whisper. She answered on the second ring. I told her everything in a rush, told her about the moved-up wedding, about being trapped, about having days left. She didn't hesitate. She told me she'd help me get out, but I had to be ready to run at a moment's notice. She'd send someone to the area, someone who'd be ready to pick me up when I could get away. I just had to make it out of the house. Making it out of the house was easier said than done. I was never alone. Someone was always there, always watching. But they were also busy with wedding preparations, with setting up our house for the ceremony, with coordinating family members who'd be arriving from out of town. I watched and waited for my chance. It came 3 days before the scheduled wedding. The house was chaos. Relatives had arrived. People I barely knew but who were apparently all part of this sick tradition. They were setting up chairs in our large living room, arranging flowers, preparing food. My mother was distracted. My father was playing host, and I was supposed to be in my room, resting before the dress fitting that afternoon. But I wasn't resting. I'd packed a small bag days ago, just essentials hidden in my closet. I'd waited until I heard my mother go downstairs, heard her voice in the kitchen talking to my aunt. I opened my window, the one that looked out over the back of our property, toward the woods that bordered our land. I was going to run. I was going to climb out that window and run through those woods and not stop until I was free. My hands shook as I grabbed my bag, as I pushed the window open wider. The drop was further than I'd thought, maybe 12 feet to the ground below. I could break an ankle. I could hurt myself and not be able to run at all. But staying was worse than any injury. I heard footsteps in the hallway. Someone was coming. I didn't have time to think, to plan, to be smart about this. I threw my bag out the window and climbed out after it, hanging from the sill before dropping. I landed hard, pain shooting through my ankles and knees, but nothing broken. I grabbed my bag and started running. I made it maybe 20 yards before I heard shouting behind me. They'd found my empty room. They'd seen the open window. I heard my father's voice bellowing my name, heard other voices joining in. I ran harder, branches whipping at my face, my lungs burning. I almost made it to the edge of our property when Adrian tackled me from behind. I hadn't heard him coming, hadn't known he was so close. We went down hard, him on top of me, his weight crushing the air from my lungs. He flipped me over, and his face was red with rage, with something else too, something wild and possessive. "Where do you think you're going?" he snarled. His hand was around my throat, not squeezing but threatening. "You're mine, Clara. You've always been mine." I fought. I clawed at his face, scratched deep gouges down his cheek. He swore and pulled back, and I brought my knee up hard between his legs. He folded with a sound of pain, and I shoved him off me and tried to run again. But there were others now. My Uncle Richard grabbed me, his arms like iron bands. He was a big man, strong, and I couldn't break free no matter how hard I struggled. He carried me back to the house while I screamed and kicked and begged. No one came to help. We were too far from any neighbors, too isolated. My family had made sure of that. They took me to my room and locked me in. I pounded on the door until my fists were bruised. I screamed until my voice was raw. No one came. Hours passed. The sun set. I sat in the darkness and cried tears of rage and frustration and fear. When my door finally opened, it was night. Adrian stood there, and behind him I could see my father. Adrian had bandages on his face where I'd scratched him. He looked at me with cold anger, and I knew I'd crossed a line I couldn't uncross. I'd shown them I'd fight. I'd shown them I'd run, and now they'd make sure I couldn't. We were going to wait, my father said from the doorway. We were going to do this properly, with ceremony, with family gathered. But you've proven you can't be trusted. So we're accelerating the timeline again. Tomorrow morning, you'll marry Adrian. And tomorrow night, he'll consummate that marriage. We'll make sure of it. The threat was clear. They'd force this. All of it. I felt sick. Felt terror so acute it was physical. A twisting in my gut. Adrian stepped into the room. He was carrying something. A syringe. "This is to help you sleep," he said, and his smile was horrible. "To make sure you don't try anything stupid during the night. We can't have you running again." When my cousin walked in with that syringe, smiling, I knew it was now or never. I kicked him and ran barefoot through the woods. I don't remember making the decision. It was pure instinct, pure survival. As he came close, as he reached for me with that needle, I kicked out hard. My foot connected with his knee and he stumbled. The syringe fell from his hand and I lunged for the door. My father tried to grab me, but I was faster, fueled by adrenaline and terror. I flew down the stairs, nearly falling, my bare feet slipping on the hardwood. I heard shouting behind me. Heard multiple footsteps. The front door was locked, deadbolted, and my shaking hands couldn't work the lock fast enough. I ran for the back of the house instead, through the kitchen, toward the door that led to our patio. My mother appeared in front of me. For a second, just a second, I thought maybe she'd help me. Maybe some maternal instinct would kick in. Maybe she'd see her daughter terrified and running and realize how wrong this all was. But her face was hard, angry. She reached for me, and I shoved her. I shoved my own mother as hard as I could, and she fell backward into the counter. I didn't stay to see if she was hurt. The back door was unlocked. I burst through it into the night, into the cool April air. I ran across our patio, across our lawn, toward the woods. Behind me, I heard the door slam open, heard my father and Adrian and others giving chase. But I had a head start, and I was running for my life. The woods were dark, nearly pitch black. I couldn't see where I was going. Branches tore at my skin. Roots tried to trip me. I fell more than once, scraped my hands and knees raw, but I got up and kept running. I could hear them behind me. Could hear Adrian calling my name in a sing-song voice that was more terrifying than anger would have been. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like hours, but was probably minutes. My lungs were burning, my feet were bleeding. I had no idea where I was going. I just knew I had to get away, had to put distance between us. I ran until I couldn't hear them anymore, until the only sounds were my own gasping breaths and the night sounds of the forest. I kept going until I broke through the tree line onto a road. A real road. Paved, with streetlights in the distance. I'd made it beyond our property, beyond the bubble of our isolated estate. I stumbled down that road, barely able to stand, looking for help, for anyone. A gas station appeared like a miracle, lit up bright against the darkness. I half ran, half stumbled toward it. The clerk behind the counter took one look at me, bloody, barefoot, wild-eyed, and reached for the phone. I thought he was calling the police, and I nearly cried with relief. But I stopped him. I gave him Sarah's number instead, the one I'd memorized. I told him to call her, to tell her Clara needed help, to tell her where we were. He looked confused, but did it. Maybe because I looked so desperate. Maybe because something in my face told him this was life or death. Sarah answered. She talked to the clerk, then told him to keep me there, to keep me safe, that help was coming. The clerk, this stranger whose name I didn't even know, gave me a bottle of water and a first aid kit. He let me sit behind the counter with him. When I kept looking at the door, terrified my family would appear, he told me he wouldn't let anyone take me who I didn't want to go with. 40 minutes later, a woman arrived. She identified herself to the clerk as Sarah's contact, showed him something on her phone to verify. She looked at me with kind eyes and asked if I was Clara. When I nodded, when I broke down crying, She put her arms around me and told me I was safe now. Her name was Detective Lisa Morrison. She worked with a task force that investigated human trafficking and forced marriage cases. Sarah had contacted her, had sent her all the evidence I'd gathered, all the photos of documents and the diary and the medical records. Detective Morrison told me that what my family was planning was illegal, that it was abuse, that I was right to run. But she also told me that to stop them, to make sure they couldn't do this to anyone else, I had to be willing to testify. I had to be willing to tell my story to authorities, to help them build a case. I was terrified. I was exhausted. I was still bleeding from my run through the woods. But I said yes. I said yes because of my grandmother, because of all the other girls in my family's history who hadn't been able to escape. I said yes because if I didn't, Adrian would just find another cousin, and this would continue. Detective Morrison took me to a hospital first. They treated my cuts, my scratched and bleeding feet, the bruises I'd gotten from Adrian's tackle, and my falls through the woods. They did a rape kit even though I told them nothing had happened, because they said if my family had been planning to force a marriage, they might have been planning other things too. A social worker stayed with me the whole time, a woman with a soft voice who kept telling me I was brave, I was strong, I was going to be okay. Then came the interviews. So many interviews. Detectives, FBI agents, because forced marriage across state lines is a federal crime. And some of our family members lived in different states. I told them everything. I showed them the evidence I'd gathered. I told them about my grandmother, about the medical records, about the genetic abnormalities they'd covered up. I told them about the moved-up wedding, about Adrian and the syringe, about how they'd planned to force the consummation. The agents listened with expressions that went from skeptical to horrified. I think at first they might have thought I was exaggerating, that maybe I was just a runaway teenager making up stories. But the evidence I'd collected, the photos of those documents, my grandmother's diary, it was all there. It was all real. And when they started digging, when they started investigating my family's history, they found more. So much more. They got a warrant. 3 days after my escape, I watched from an unmarked car as FBI agents and local police surrounded my family's house. I watched them knock on the door, then force it open when no one answered fast enough. I watched my father led out in handcuffs, his face purple with rage. My mother came next, crying, reaching back toward the house. Adrian fought them, actually tried to resist arrest, and they forced him to the ground, cuffed him roughly. When agents burst into our basement and found the files, I cried. They weren't just planning my life, they'd planned hundreds. The basement had filing cabinets I'd never known existed, full of records going back generations. Marriages they'd arranged, children they'd tracked, genetic profiles they'd created. They found correspondence with other families who practiced the same thing. A whole network of people who believed in bloodline purity, who arranged marriages between relatives, who treated their children like breeding stock. They found evidence of worse things too. Financial records showing payoffs to doctors who'd helped them, who'd kept silent about the genetic problems in their children. Records of children who'd been born disabled and sent away to institutions, hidden so they wouldn't mar the family's reputation. Evidence that my grandmother hadn't died in an accident at all, that she'd been killed by her own family for trying to leave, and they'd covered it up so thoroughly that it had been ruled accidental. I cried for Elizabeth. I cried for all of them, all the girls and boys trapped in this nightmare, going back generations. I cried because the evidence was there, undeniable, and now the world would know. Now no one could pretend this hadn't happened. The arrests were just the beginning. The trials took over a year. My father, my mother, my aunt and uncle, Adrian all charged with conspiracy to commit forced marriage, child abuse, conspiracy to commit sexual assault of a minor. Some family members took plea deals, testified against the others. Others fought the charges, claimed religious freedom, claimed family tradition. It didn't matter. The evidence was overwhelming. Other families in the network were exposed too. In 6 different states, arrests were made. Children were removed from homes where similar situations were happening. The FBI found dozens of cases similar to mine, families with the same sick ideology, the same practices. My story was the thread that unraveled so much more. I had to testify at the trials. I had to sit in a courtroom and face my parents, face Adrian, and tell strangers the most intimate, painful details of my life. I had to describe the purity lessons, the medical examinations, the wedding planning. I had to talk about Adrian's assault, about my father's threats, about my mother's complicity. Defense attorneys tried to discredit me, tried to paint me as a rebellious teenager who'd misunderstood my family's traditions. But the evidence spoke for itself. My father got 15 years. My mother got 10. Adrian got 20, he was older. He was considered the primary aggressor in the planned assault. My aunt and uncle got 8 years each. Watching my parents led away in cuffs didn't feel like victory. It felt like waking from a nightmare I'd been born into. There was satisfaction. Yes. Knowing they'd face consequences. Knowing they couldn't hurt anyone else. But there was also this deep, aching grief for the family I'd thought I had. For the parents I'd thought loved me. They'd never loved me. Not really. They'd loved what I represented. What I could give them. But not me. In the aftermath, family members I barely knew came out of the woodwork. Some of them I'd met once or twice at gatherings. Others I'd never known existed. They sent me messages, some supportive, some angry. Some thanked me for exposing the truth, told me they'd suspected but hadn't known how to speak up. Others called me a traitor, said I'd destroyed our family for nothing, that I should have been honored by the role I was chosen for. Those messages hurt more than I expected. They reminded me that the ideology ran deep, that some people were so indoctrinated they couldn't see the abuse even when it was spelled out for them. But there were also messages from cousins, from second cousins, and distant relatives who told me they'd been in similar situations. Girls who'd been promised to cousins or uncles, who'd been told it was their duty, their honor. Some had managed to escape and were now living quiet lives far from the family. Others had submitted, had gone through with marriages they didn't want, and were now trapped in their own private nightmares. Those messages broke my heart. I'd saved myself, but I couldn't save everyone. Some of them were too afraid to testify, too afraid to leave. The programming ran too deep. I've spent the last 2 years rebuilding my life from nothing. I had to learn how to be a person outside of my family's expectations. I had to learn what I actually liked, what I actually wanted. Simple things, what kind of music I enjoyed, what foods I preferred, what clothes I wanted to wear. I had to discover all of it because I'd never been allowed to have preferences before. I lived in foster care for a few months after the arrests, until I turned 18. The foster family was kind, patient with me as I navigated panic attacks and nightmares, and this overwhelming sense of being lost. I started therapy, real therapy, with someone who specialized in trauma and high control groups. Slowly, painfully, I started to heal. I got my GED, then enrolled in community college. I'm studying psychology now. I want to understand what happened to me, want to help others who've been through similar things. I volunteer with an organization that helps people escape from forced marriage situations, from families, or communities with the same kind of controlling ideology. I talk to girls who are where I was, who are trapped and scared and don't see a way out. I tell them my story. I tell them escape is possible. I'm not who they raised me to be. I'm who I chose to become free, alive, and determined to end their cycle forever. There's anger still. So much anger. It lives in my chest like a fire that won't go out. I'm angry at my parents for what they tried to do to me. I'm angry at every adult in my family who knew and said nothing, who participated, who normalized the abuse. I'm angry at a system that almost failed me, that came so close to letting this happen. I'm angry at how many others this did happen to. How many girls became Elizabeth before I became the one who got away. But alongside the anger is something else now. It's not quite peace, I don't know if I'll ever have that. But it's a kind of fierce joy, a defiant happiness. I wake up every morning and I make my own choices. I decide what to wear, what to eat, where to go. I have friends now. Real friends who who chose me back. I went on a date last month, a real date, with a guy I met at school, who doesn't share my DNA, who looks at me like I'm a person and not a vessel for the next generation. The date was terrifying. I had a panic attack in the bathroom halfway through, but he was patient, kind. When I told him a version of my story, not all of it, not yet, but enough he didn't run. He listened. He told me I was brave. And for the first time, I believed it. I am brave. I survived something that could have destroyed me, and I'm still here, still fighting, still building a life. I still have nightmares sometimes. I dream about the wedding, about Adrian with that syringe, about my father's face when he told me I'd marry whether I wanted to or not. I dream about running through the woods and never finding that road, never finding that gas station. I wake up gasping, reaching for my phone to remind myself where I am, that I'm safe. The trauma doesn't just disappear because the people who caused it are in prison, but I'm learning to live with it. I'm learning that healing isn't linear, that some days I'll feel strong, and other days I'll feel like that scared 17-year-old locked in her room. I'm learning to be gentle with myself, to recognize that what I went through was extraordinary, and that it's okay if recovery takes time. I think about my grandmother a lot, about Elizabeth, who tried to escape and didn't make it. I wish I could tell her that she wasn't forgotten, that her diary saved me, that her story mattered. I wish I could tell her that the family that killed her is facing justice now, that their secrets are exposed, that their power is broken. I like to think that somehow, wherever she is, she knows that the girls who came before, the ones who didn't escape, the ones whose stories were erased, I like to think they're proud of me for running, for fighting, for refusing to be another silent victim. If you've ever felt trapped by people who claim to love you, this story is for you. If you've ever been told that abuse was tradition, that control was care, that someone else's plans for your life mattered more than your own dreams, this story is for you. You're not crazy for wanting to escape. You're not selfish for choosing yourself. You're not a traitor for exposing abuse. You deserve freedom. You deserve safety. You deserve to build your own life on your own terms. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Tell me if this story resonated with you, if you've experienced something similar, if you know someone who needs to hear this. Don't forget to subscribe for more true stories like mine, because the more we talk about these things, the more we expose them, the less power they have. Silence protects abusers. Speaking up protects victims. So speak up. Tell your story. Break the cycle. And if you're trapped right now, if you're living in a situation where people are planning your life without your consent, please reach out for help. There are people like Sarah, like Detective Morrison, like the volunteers I work with now, who will believe you, who will help you escape. You're not alone. You never were. And there is a life waiting for you on the other side of that fear. A life so beautiful and free, and yours that it's worth every terrifying step it takes to get there.